Formula 1 is a sport, more often than not, decided by who has the fastest car in any given year. Unless your name is Lando Norris in 2024, the likelihood is that even if the best car on track isn't driven by the outright quickest or most consistent driver, it can still yield both individual and constructors' championship glory, even if there were more worthy candidates who performed better in comparatively worse machinery who never got a chance to shine. Partly inspired by Norris and his escapades throughout last season, and many other times where those fighting for titles have been overrated or underappreciated in their efforts, in this video I will aim to highlight the best driver from every season in Formula 1 World Championship history, and crown them based on individual performance. Before we get properly into this, let me make a few points first. To begin with, the best individual from a given year may not be the real-life champion. It might be someone who finished second, third, or maybe even lower down, who outperformed the expected results of their machinery, so it doesn't matter whether a driver had the outright fastest car or the 10th fastest. If they did well in their quality of machinery, they will be fairly represented. Secondly, I may miss one or two performances from backmarker or midfield drivers who, let's say for example, carried a car that should have finished 15th on average all the way to 10th on most occasions. Very rarely will the best drivers find themselves towards the rear of the field, but especially in the early years, there may be a few that slip through the net. With those points explained, let's get into the video and discuss which drivers were the best in every F1 season and redistribute the titles to more accurately reflect the ability that might otherwise go unrecognised for some drivers. The first World Championship in 1950 was won by Giuseppe Farina in real life, but in my opinion, his teammate Juan Manuel Fangio was the better driver. The reason for this is because Farina only dropped out of the points once due to mechanical issues, while Fangio retired 3 times from his total 6 starts from the year. Had the Argentine achieved a similar reliability to that of his Italian counterpart, he would have taken the title fairly comfortably, so with the first ever season, we already see our best driver not correlate with the eventual champion. 1951 saw Fangio claim his first title in real life, and this year his performances require less explanation as to why he was the best performer, as although honourable mentions go to the Ferrari duo of Alberto Ascari and Jose Froilan Gonzalez, who arguably did well given their machinery was inferior to the Alfa Romeo at the beginning of the campaign, but overall, I believe El Maestro fairly comfortably takes his second crown in the sophomore season of Formula 1 if we give it to the best driver. In 1952, Fangio sat out the season due to breaking his neck in a non-championship event at Monza before the season started, opening the door for the aforementioned Ascari to take his maiden title with the dominant Ferrari 500 chassis that was built to Formula 2 regulations. He won 6 of the 8 rounds, having missed the Swiss Grand Prix to compete in the Indianapolis 500, which was also part of the F1 Championship at the time, but he retired in the American race that he chose to take part in. I think this could prove to be the easiest decision of the entire list, as no one has ever, nor will ever, again win as emphatically as Ascari did in 1952. The Italian became the first person in this alternative reality other than Fangio to claim a championship, and in real life won the title again in 1953, much less convincingly as his Argentine rival returned from injury, and the Maseratis used by him were worse than Ascari's less dominant yet still class of the field prancing horse, so I think I'm going to give this one to Fangio. The gap between the pair was only 6 points in the final standings, although Alberto lost 12 due to drop scores being in effect to curb the poor reliability of the era, but the unexpected performance of the Scuderia car was reeled in by the scoring system. This is maybe a bit harsh to take away Alberto's second successive title, but I feel like his machinery heavily flattered him, whereas Maserati's other drivers never got to finish higher than 3rd, while Ferrari took 7 victories to the solitary 1 scored by their Italian counterparts, so I think given the machinery, Fangio did the better job. The now 3-time champion went almost uncontested in 1954, winning 6 of his 8 starts and scored nearly double the points of championship runner-up, his compatriot Gonzalez, despite switching from Maserati to Mercedes-Benz mid-season. I think we can safely say that he takes his 4th title here based on pure performance. 1955 saw the emergence of young Brit Stirling Moss, who took his first win at Aintree, but his ever-dominant Argentine teammate took his 3rd crown in real life, which in this universe is his 5th, as both of the Mercedes pair were fairly unmatched throughout the year, apart from maybe the good performances of Italian Eugenio Castellotti. In 1956, Fangio saw his almost unchallenged stronghold on the sport become less concrete as Moss, driving for Maserati while the multiple-time champion switched to Ferrari, had the first moment of his career where he seemed to become unstuck. The Monaco Grand Prix of that year was arguably the worst of his F1 tenure, but he still topped Stirling in the points standings. The Lancia-derived design of the prancing horse's D50 was forward-thinking for the time, but Moss's 250F was also a very solid piece of kit, and given the second drivers of the respective teams, Jean Berra and Peter Collins, were relatively close, I think that confirms that there wasn't a huge gulf in performance between the two cars. You could also argue that Collins himself was in the mix, and would have probably won the title in real life if he didn't hand his car over in Monza, but I don't necessarily think that equates to him deserving it over his teammate, as the Brit had one less mechanical failure. I think Fangio claims this crown as he did in real life, for those reasons, and this is his 6th one in my reality, and his 4th consecutively. 1957 was much more comfortable than the previous year, and in his final full campaign, Fangio took 4 wins from 7 starts and crushed everyone in the points. That Maserati was fast, but especially towards the end of the year, Moss and Tony Brooks's Van Wall cars were arguably quicker. I think the Argentine Maestro fairly claims his 7th crown here and promptly retires from full-time F1, having solidified his legacy, amassing a 100% winning record in seasons he competed in, only interjected by Ascari's 1952 triumph while he recovered from his broken neck. His retirement opened the door for his ex-teammate Moss and Ferrari's Mike Hawthorn to take the reins at the top of the sport, and in real life it was the Scuderia driver who took it, but given the Van Wall competitor had 3 more mechanical retirements, and nobly had his rival reinstated at the Portuguese Grand Prix, I think we can hand Stirling this title quite comfortably, giving him the crown that he deserved from an illustrious career, as he was the better driver throughout the year. As rear-engined cars became the norm in 1959, it was the Cooper team and Jack Brabham who took the crown, but the British duo of Brooks and Moss were hot on his heels in the points, despite worse reliability. Given that the reigning champion from this universe amassed 4 pole positions and the same number of fastest laps, more than the other 2 drivers combined, I'll give this championship to Stirling over Brabham, as the Australian won the title thanks to how often his car finished, more so than his overall performance. To summarise the opening decade of Formula 1, Juan Manuel Fangio dominated proceedings, winning every season bar the one he missed in 1952, before his retirement opened the door for his protégé of sorts to become the only other multiple champion of the decade. El Maestro's 7 titles will be difficult to match or beat, even with the advancements in safety and drivers becoming younger, lending to the greats having far longer careers on average in later years. Moving on to 1960, given that Moss missed 3 races in the middle of the year, and no one outside of him and the Cooper duo of Brabham and Bruce McLaren really made their mark, we've got to say that after we took the Australian's crown away from him the previous year, Brabham deserves the championship, with his impressive 5-race win streak being the biggest achievement. A new decade saw a new champion come along, a trend that in real life would start as Phil Hill took the honours after his rival Wolfgang von Trips passed away following an accident at Monza in 1961, but in my opinion, this duo are some of the worst drivers to be in World Championship contention in history. For me, the American Hill is also the worst F1 champion in history, although saying that is like saying that someone is the quote-unquote worst runner in the 100-metre final. It's still a very high bar in talent. And that's just on F1 results, by the way. I know that Hill had a very illustrious endurance racing career, but that doesn't take into account in this video. I'm torn between giving this to one of 2 drivers, Moss in the Rob Walker ran Lotuses or Dan Gurney in the Works Porsche. By all accounts, the Stuttgart operation wasn't ready for title glory yet, and Gurney was ruthlessly consistent, achieving several podiums. I think that aside from Stirling's fantastic performance in Monaco and win at the Nordschleife, his season was less consistent than the American, so I think I'll give this one to Gurney. He becomes so far the driver who finished the lowest in the standings, yet takes the crown as the best performer given his machinery, sitting in 4th in the real-life table, but nonetheless, he is our 4th champion of this alternate reality. Moss had his career-ending crash at Goodwood on Easter Monday in 1962, opening the door to a wave of new British talent such as Graham Hill, Jim Clark and John Surtees. It's the former 2 who fought it out for the crown in real life, and although the Scottish driver took 6 poles and 5 fastest laps from a 9-race campaign, he had 5 mechanical failures in races to the Englishman's 1. Given Clark was well known for his courteous and less aggressive style that often improved his car's reliability, I'll give this one to him, as he would have easily walked 1 or 2 more races had his machinery held up. 1963 saw the young Scot take his first title in real life, and is the same in this reality. 7 wins, the same amount of poles, and 6 fastest laps. Need I say more? The following year was much closer, however, as in a turn of events that would now see the walls of the Sky Sports commentary box covered in a mysterious white liquid, 3 Brits fought for the World Championship. Clark's Lotus was fast but very temperamental, Hill's BRM had a lower peak performance but better reliability, and Surtees' Ferrari had a mix of both worlds, which saw the former motorbike racing legend take the title. Unfortunately for him, I believe both of the others performed better given their cars, with Clark taking the bulk of the pole positions as we've become used to at this point. 1961 champion Gurney also performed well, despite an appalling reliability record, but I think that between the BRM and the Lotus, I'll give it to Clark as he had 2 more race-ending issues than Hill. 1965 was another dominant season for the reigning champion of this reality, as despite missing the Monaco Grand Prix, Clark won all of his first 6 events competed in and took the title at a canter, a feat he repeated on merit, taking his 4th consecutive crown. With the new 3-litre engine regulations in 1966, retirement rates went through the roof as most drivers, bar real champion Jack Brabham and Jochen Rindt Cooper, finished less than half the races of the year. The Aussie seemingly won it at a canter, taking 4 victories on the bounce in the mid-season, but everyone else's cars spontaneously blowing up made it seem like more of a done deal than it actually was. Despite finishing 6th in the standings, I'd argue the 4-time reigning champion in this reality, Clark, did far better given his car that fell apart if you even so as looked at it. No disrespect to Brabham, it wasn't a bad season for him by any stretch, but everyone else bar his own team failing to adapt to new regulations basically handed him a 3rd title, while in this universe, Clark takes his 5th consecutive crown, equaling Fangio's stretch from 1953 to 57. The Lotus was markedly more consistent in 1967, and although Denny Hulme took the championship in real life, he only had 2 retirements, to Clark's 5. I know this probably looks like I'm just handing everything on a silver platter for him to eat up, but the woeful reliability of his era scuppered the chances of so many drivers, Clark in particular, so giving him his 6th consecutive championship, for me, isn't too far of a stretch. Unfortunately for him, he wouldn't get a chance to equal the mark of 7 titles set by Fangio, as he was killed in a crash at Hockenheim in F2 after the first F1 race of the year in Kyalami, allowing his longtime adversary, Hill, to take glory. Jackie Stewart had an impressive run to 2nd in the standings, but him missing 2 races mean that Graham's title stays in my opinion, his first in this reality, after losing out in 1962. The following year saw Stewart win his first championship in reality, and in this universe, that accolade should stay, as he nearly doubled the points tally of runner-up Jackie Ickx. The 1960s was a decade full of domination, but there were hints of parity too. Jack Brabham's 3 titles up until this point in real life have been condensed to 1, whereas Phil Hill lost his championship to Dan Gurney because the other American did far better given his machinery. Clark's sheer consistency swept through the middle of a decade, and he got so close to equaling Fangio's fantastic total of titles. Just like the Argentine's removal from proceedings, the Scottish driver's passing opened the door for established talent to finally get a foot in, as Graham Hill and Stewart finally achieved titles of their own, while the one-timers of Surtees and Hulme lost their crowning achievements. After 2 decades of Formula 1 racing, in this alternate universe that rewards individual performances over the car, 9 of the 20 seasons completed saw a different champion to real life, proving that cars have always played a huge part in who takes the plaudits at the end of each year. Heading into a new decade, 1970 is a tough season to call, as although Rindt dominated before his untimely death, with 4 races still left to run, Ickx and the rookie Clay Regazzoni turned it on in the latter half of the year. I'll go with Rindt purely because his missed races weren't exactly planned, nor his own fault, and the Belgian and Swiss drivers behind him had plenty of opportunities to take the crown from him, yet they didn't take them. The next year after that saw Stewart stamp his authority on most of the competition, although the emergence of Ronnie Peterson in the March does threaten the Scot. I'll give Jackie his 2nd title, and I think he also greatly outperformed Emerson Fittipaldi in 1972, as the Lotus he was driving was far more revolutionary than Stewart's Tyrrell. That means that Stewart still achieves 3 championships, he just achieves it earlier than he did in reality. Peterson ruffled some feathers in 71, but wrangled the neck out of his own Colin Chapman-designed chassis in 73, and in my opinion was levels above his teammate Fittipaldi and slightly better than Stewart, who was competing in his final season. Ronnie did sometimes break his cars, retiring from 8 out of 15 races, but I think overall, he takes what would have been Jackie's 4th title in this reality away from him and makes it his own. There are multiple candidates for who was the best driver in the following year, 1974, and I don't think the real-life winner Fittipaldi is one of them. In my opinion, Peterson, Jody Scheckter and Niki Lauda all had better seasons than him, but picking between the trio is difficult. Lauda had a fantastic second half of the year and took 6 pole positions in a row at one point, while Scheckter ironed out his mistake-ridden debut campaign to drag a demoralised and downrated Tyrrell team to a 3rd in the drivers' standings. Peterson broke his cars even more than the previous year, so in the end, I think I'll give this to the Austrian driver. Niki built on his success from the latter portion of 1974 and crushed the field in 75 to take the title pretty convincingly, his 2nd in a row. The likes of Fittipaldi simply couldn't match his consistency, but in the following campaign, Lauda's mettle was tested in the most challenging way possible. He was dominating proceedings before his accident at the Nürburgring, and even when racing while not fully recovered, had the measure of his teammate, and only lost out to James Hunt because he pulled out at Fuji. Hunt's resolve to win races and claw back points while Nicky was in hospital, and even when he was back on track, was impressive too, there's no doubt about that, but Lauda was the better driver by a country mile before his crash, and any points gained after it were a Herculean effort from him. That was his third consecutive title in this universe, but he made it 4 in a row in 77, as even when missing the last duo of races in the year, he won by nearly 2 wins worth of points, with the likes of Scheckter and Mario Andretti struggling to get near him. The aforementioned American took his only title in real life in 1978, however his teammate, and former champion in this reality, Ronnie Peterson, was under orders to finish behind Andretti if the two were leading at the front of a race. Given Ronnie died in the third to last round and still only ended up 13 points away from Mario, I believe he was the better driver before his passing as a result of the accident at the start of the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Thus, I believe the Swede can rightfully claim his second championship posthumously, just like Rins did in 1970. The year after saw the re-emergence of Ferrari and the upcoming of Williams and Ligier for the first time. The likes of Jacques Laffite, Alan Jones and Regazzoni were impressive, but the scarlet cars of Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve took all the glory. Some have said that Villeneuve, like Peterson, was either forced to allow Scheckter to beat him, or felt he should just gather experience in that sort of environment, instead of fighting his veteran teammate. But regardless of the explanation, there were several times Gilles finished ahead, but his results were just too inconsistent to challenge Jody, so I think the South African's sole title is deserved, and he was the last driver crowned in the 1970s. 5 of the 10 seasons saw titles reappropriated from real life, with the main beneficiaries being Niki Lauda, who goes from a 2-time champion to a 4-time, and Ronnie Peterson has 2 titles, while Emerson Fittipaldi lost both his championship, and Hunt and Andretti lost their solitary crowns. 1980 saw Williams' late season form from the previous year transpired to give Alan Jones his first championship, and despite a challenge from Nelson Piquet, the Aussie was more consistent and less error-prone, meaning he deserved the title. Piquet came back with a resurgence in 81, but his crashes and mistakes lingered, and with the declassification of the race at Kyalami, which was run by Carlos Reutemann, I believe the Argentine driver was better than the Brazilian, even if he crumbled in the late season. Reutemann would become the first champion from his country since Fangio, and an underrated one-timer in my opinion. 1982 has so many honourable mentions for title-worthy drivers, whether it be the real-life winner, Keke Rosberg, or Didier Pironi, John Watson, or even Alain Prost. Pironi for me would have taken the championship had he not had his career-ending crash at Hockenheim, but he and Rosberg were fairly level, albeit in different circumstances, as Keke's Williams was slower yet more reliable. For me though, Alain Prost was better than both of them. Rosberg had a fantastically consistent year, and while the results don't look like it, Prost did too. He led the points standings after the 6th round in Monaco, despite having only finished 2 races up until that point, and if he finished without issue, he tended to do so either in first or second. His Renault was arguably the best car on one-lap pace, but including reliability, it definitely wasn't the best, yet he was only a race wins points gap from the top spot. That for me makes him slightly better than Rosberg, Pironi and co in my opinion, so he takes his first title here 3 years earlier than he did in real life. Rosberg didn't necessarily have a bad season, nor did Pironi, but for me, they were just slightly below the level that Prost was at. 1983 saw the Frenchman fight Piquet in fairly equal machinery, with similar reliability, and it was the Brazilian who won by 2 points. Alain had a stinker weekend in Detroit which cost him, and I think overall Nelson was the slightly better driver, so he takes his first crown here. Prost got his second runner-up finish in a row in 1984, this time to Niki Lauda, who was at the peak of his F1 return. Although the Austrian lacked any qualifying pace, he mastered driving in race trim, and more often than not beat Alain on track when both drivers finished. I've covered why Lauda's career overall, and this season in particular, is underrated in a separate video, but essentially, he beat Prost at his own game, consistent race pace. This was Niki's 5th title in this universe, 1 off Clark and 2 behind Fangio, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest, even if in real life he didn't have that legacy of multiple championships as much as he did here. 1985 saw Prost finally break his 2-year championship duck, and although the new phenomenon Ayrton Senna and the consistent Michele Alboreto had moments, it is safe to say that Alain was finally the better driver of the year after multiple chances had fallen through his grasp since 1982. He went back-to-back in real life in 1986, but the chasing Williams duo of Piquet and Nigel Mansell were hot on his heels. The three of them had a very similar reliability rate, and I think the Grove cars were slightly better than the McLaren, so for Prost to win the championship despite being in a slow machine does prove his worth for me. Had the teammates behind him not taken points off each other, it could have been a different story, but they did, and Alain capitalised to win his third crown. Even despite Piquet's crash in practice at Imola the following year, he had the measure of Mansell by a small margin. Prost was also in the mix for the best driver status, as was Senna, as both outperformed the expectations of their less competitive machines. But between the French and Brazilian former champions, I think that the fact that Prost won the same number of races as someone in a much better car must be taken into account, and thus Alain wins his third consecutive crown and fourth in total, so far, at the end of 1987. 88 saw Senna move to McLaren to partner the reigning champion, and he beat him in the championship, although Prost scored more points and lost out due to drop scores, despite on average beating Ayrton in the races. It's clearly between these two, and on consistency, I think Alain edges it over his Brazilian teammate. The two were much closer in 1989, and although Senna had bad luck on the reliability front, the eventual gap to Prost in the standings was only similar to the points he may have lost as a result, not more. The Suzuka incident was the French driver's fault undoubtedly, but he didn't even need to do that. Had he let him by and finished second behind his rival, he would have guaranteed the title, so I don't know why he did that, to be honest. Nonetheless, the pair were fairly equal across the year in race trim, although Senna did have one mistake in Adelaide, crashing into Martin Brundle, so I think begrudgingly, this one has to go to Prost too to make it 6 for the Frenchman. The 1980s saw 4 titles swap hands, as the Reutemann got recognition for his great season in 81, while Prost was the main beneficiary of this system, winning 4 more titles than in real life, while Senna lost his own crown, and Piquet lost one of his championships at the behest of the French driver, who stamped his authority on the decade in similarly to what Fangio did in the 50s, and another was lost by Piquet to Reutemann. The new decade saw more controversy, as Senna and Prost collided again in Japan, this time obviously Senna's fault. But given that the French driver's teammate Mansell couldn't beat Berger in the sister McLaren, I think the Ferrari was slightly worse as a car overall. We don't know how Suzuka would have panned out, but a win for Alain would bring him to within 3 points of Ayrton in a marginally less fast car, so I think Prost personally was just about better, claiming his 7th title to level Fangio and take his 6th consecutive crown. 1991 was a fight between Senna and Mansell, and although the Englishman's gearbox was temperamental in the first few races, he only had one more retirement than the Brazilian, and despite the fact that the Grove car was faster for a portion of the season, Ayrton took the title by a comfortable margin. I think this gives Senna his first title, and breaks his arch-rival Prost's 6-season streak. Nigel came back with a vengeance in 1992, as he was almost unquestionably the best driver in the best car, but he left F1 in 1993 to make way for the joint most successful driver in history at this point to take over his machine and take, potentially, his record-equalling crown. While Prost had the measure of Damon Hill, I think at 40 years old, in a car unsuited to his driving style, he looked less impressive compared to his eternal adversary Senna, who in this universe takes his 2nd world title, thanks partly due to sterling drives in Donington and Monaco, but also through maximising his machinery on a much more consistent basis than Alain did. Michael Schumacher came to the forefront in 1994, and even though he was banned or disqualified from a quarter of the season's races, he beat Hill to the title in a worse car. Adelaide wasn't Michael's fault, but even if it was, Hill had plenty of opportunities to take the advantage of his own that he simply couldn't. If 1994 was clumsy for Damon because he missed an open goal, 95 was just embarrassing. There is no debate that Schumacher won the title in a worse car because both Williams drivers underperformed, so he takes his 2nd crown in a row here. 96 was Hill's title-winning year in real life, but only just defeating a rookie Jacques Villeneuve, while both were error-prone, means neither of them performed better than Schumacher, who dragged the 3rd best car, the new Ferrari, to several wins. It was a similar story in 97, as the Scuderia car of Michael was not on the same level as Villeneuve's Williams, yet he got it to a title decider. Even with the intentional takeout in Jerez, I believe that considering his car was comfortably 2nd quickest and shouldn't have been anywhere near a championship fight, Schumacher was the best driver for the 4th year running. 1998, however, was far closer, as Mika Hakkinen became the first driver to really take it to the German. The McLaren was the better car, and Hakkinen had 2 less retirements, but also had more pole positions, which proves that in qualifying he had the edge. This is one of the closest judgments I'll have to make, but I'll give it to Michael, despite him finishing runner-up in the standings. Hakkinen took his 2nd consecutive title in real life in 99, but he crashed out of the lead many times and was inconsistent. His rival Eddie Irvine, meanwhile, was just not ready to assume the number 1 role at Ferrari mid-season after Michael's leg break and underperformed in the best car. Thus, I believe this title should go to third place man who drove for Jordan, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who essentially picked up the pieces from where the top two faltered. He doesn't necessarily get this because he was a fantastic driver who deserved to be a champion. He gets it because he performed very well in a year everyone else seemed to not want to win. As the millennium drew to a close, the reign of Prost, Senna and Mansell was replaced by that of Schumacher. 5 consecutive titles, and Frentzen's steal in '99 probably would have increased German interest in F1, while although we lost Hill and Villeneuve's wins, it's obvious that they were both propped up in differing amounts by Adrian Newey's Williams cars, while Hakkinen was unlucky to have both his successors taken away from him, as 1998 was a great year, but the campaign following was at points embarrassing. Schumacher kicked off the new campaign by winning the 2000 season over Hakkinen, despite more retirements, taking his 6th crown in this universe, equaling Clark and only 1 behind Fangio and Prost. He joined the two legends at the top just 1 year later, scoring nearly double the tally of second place Coulthard, so I don't think any explanation is necessary as to why he takes this accolade. His 7th championship in 8 seasons became 8 from 9 in 2002, as Michael scored a podium in every race, absolutely beating the chasing field into submission, even if he got team orders one too many times, in Austria. The German legend became slightly unstuck a year later though, as the young upstarts Kimi Räikkönen and Juan Pablo Montoya took him to a title decider in Suzuka that Michael won in real life. His form over the European heatwave was pretty poor thanks to the Bridgestone tyres, but that doesn't take anything away from the Finn or the Colombian behind him. Räikkönen took only 1 win but got 7 second place finishes, while Montoya got 2 victories but was more inconsistent. Kimi had much more bad luck than Michael, as did Montoya, yet he finished only 2 points off the Ferrari driver. I think I can confidently say Räikkönen was the better driver on average in 2003, and the ruling regarding tyre deformities in the late season scuppered him just as much as the heatwave did Schumacher. Michael was back on form in 04 though, and although Räikkönen had an underrated campaign, I can't give it to him. So that's Schui's 9th title, as he took 13 wins and completely dominated. 2005 saw the Ferrari empire fall and Alonso take the crown, but Kimi was the one who impressed the most, as his car refused to let him finish races he was leading. He lost around 40 points due to retirements, and went out 3 times while in first due to no fault of his own. His one-lap pace and consistency was unmatched by anyone, and thus, in this reality, he claims his 2nd title. 06 saw Alonso beat the eternal legend Schumacher in his final year with Ferrari, and the Spaniard showed his mettle just like he had done the year before, but given that Michael was less impressive than he had been in his prime, I think we can give this title to Fernando as he was the better driver, and give him his 1st crown. The next season saw the debut of Lewis Hamilton, and while he and Alonso fought Räikkönen for the championship, the Finn triumphed despite having 2 mechanical retirements to the McLaren duo's 0 combined. Hamilton did have the gearbox problem in Brazil, but overall, his campaign was overrated for many reasons that I've already covered extensively, both on this channel and on the DRS Train podcast. Essentially, he had extra time testing the McLaren chassis before Alonso was even allowed to, and unlike the reigning champion, had spent the recent seasons in his junior career on Bridgestone tyres that handled vastly different to the Michelins that Fernando was used to. Those advantages made Lewis's rookie season look much more impressive than it actually was, and don't get me wrong, he was great that year, but he wasn't the best driver, nor better than Alonso, even when the Spaniard had the worst performance up to that point in his career. Kimi takes his 3rd crown as the best driver because of the McLaren duo squabbling, but Lewis came back strong in 2008. There were several impressive contenders this year, notably Robert Kubica and Alonso, but Hamilton delivered in his sophomore campaign to take his 1st title in real life, and also in this alternate universe too, as Massa was too error-prone, albeit would have still been a worthy champion had Brazil gone differently. 2009 is a weird one to call because it seemed like both Jenson Button and Sebastian Vettel's individual performances tended to be proportionally linked to how good their car was at different points in the year. Both were inconsistent when their car was less competitive, while their teammates mostly were the inverse to their showings. The reigning champion Hamilton was only good from the mid-season onwards, so on the basis of consistency alone, I'm going to give this one to Räikkönen. I'm not one of those guys who thinks Kimi is a god amongst people, like some of my fellow podcast hosts, and this title comes about only because he was the one guy in a top car who consistently performed at a high level in that year. The noughties was a decade of 2 halves in this reality, as Schumacher's almost perfect sweep from the turn of a millennium to 04 gave him a scarcely believable 9 championships in total. But Räikkönen also proved his worth and won 4 times despite not really dominating in any year bar 2005. In 03, 7 and 9, he pounced on the fact that other drivers were inconsistent, rather than having an outright pace advantage for the whole year. Alonso only claims one championship, while Button lost his real-life crown thanks to poor form in the second half of the year as Brawn slipped down the order. A new decade brought an absolute banger of a season, as 5 or even 6 drivers were in title contention in 2010, culminating in a lot of people who could claim they were the best. The main 3 were eventual champion Vettel, his teammate Mark Webber, and Ferrari's new recruit Alonso, while dark horse Kubica could have done a 1999 Frentzen or a 1961 Gurney had the top guys been less competitive. Fernando was ruthlessly consistent, while Webber and Vettel were more poignant at some parts of the campaign than others, with crucial mistakes coming from both of the Milton Keynes drivers. I'll give this one to Alonso, his second title, on the basis of consistency, as he rarely made errors and was impressive in a car that definitely wasn't the fastest. Vettel wiped the floor with everyone in 2011 in a car perfectly designed to his strengths, so I think it's a pretty resounding first championship for him, but 2012 was far closer. Just like 2 years earlier, several drivers put in fantastic performances in a year with 6 champions on the grid. As Alonso dragged his Ferrari to a season finale, Hamilton did a diluted version of Raikkonen's 2005, while Kimi himself had a very good comeback season. Vettel performed well in a car that wasn't as focused as previous, and wildcards like Pastor Maldonado at times looked like the best driver by a long way. I have to give this to Fernando, because that Ferrari probably averaged out to being between 2nd and 3rd best throughout the year, yet he nearly won the title in real life. This is his 3rd triumph of this reality, and although the rest of the grid was impressive, he was on another level. Vettel is the obvious choice for 2013, as he copy and pasted his 2011 campaign, and again, the likes of Alonso, Hamilton and Nico Rosberg had a chance in the first half of the year, but were blown away in the second portion of the calendar. Hamilton beat Rosberg to the first championship of the turbo hybrid era in a great season, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Alonso dragging his awful Ferrari to 6th in the standings was slightly more impressive. I know you guys might probably be thinking, this guy's still an Alonso and Raikkonen fanboy. I'm not. It's just their peaks were a lot better than what other drivers were in this era. The fact he nearly won with that piece of junk shows just how good he is when the chips are down, and while Lewis had a very good year, he wasn't completely infallible. Hungary and other races proved that. Alonso's 4th crown draws him level with Raikkonen, but Hamilton absolutely destroyed the field in 2015 in what is in my opinion his best ever season. He sealed it with 3 rounds remaining, and aside from Vettel, who did well at Ferrari, no one comes even close. 2016 is a tough one to call though. Lewis doesn't deserve it because of his awful starts and constant bottling, and although Rosberg was better and more consistent if not slightly worse in wheel-to-wheel combat, that's not exactly a shining example. I want to almost go with a rogue pick like Vettel or Max Verstappen in his debut year for Red Bull, but no one in particular stands out as the best driver for both consistency and raw pace. It would be insane to go for a back marker like Felipe Nasr or Pascal Wehrlein, so I think I'll go with a safer option of Verstappen. He had the most complete season out of all the top guys, and impressed by winning in Spain by being mostly consistent at the young age of 18. He had clumsy weekends like Monaco, but from the middle of the campaign onwards had the measure of Ricciardo, his teammate, who was far more experienced than he was. This is Max's first title, and although it's a bit out there, I'll stand by this and say he was far better than both Mercedes, both Ferraris, and Ricciardo from Spain onwards. I think I was considering giving this to Vettel, but his late season form was pretty poor, so that's why I gave it to the Dutchman in the end. 2017 saw both Hamilton and Vettel, who fought for the real-life crown, have imperfect seasons, but Lewis made less errors and no one else really stands out, so I think this becomes his 3rd championship after 2008 and 2015. I can comfortably say he claims his 4th title in the following campaign, as Vettel and Verstappen crashed every 5 seconds, Bottas was awful, and Ricciardo was salty that the young upstart he had as a teammate was being a terrorist, yet still performed better than he was, and was Red Bull's priority. 2019 saw Hamilton take his 6th crown in real life, and he had a very good season, but I think there's a case to be made that Verstappen, in his first properly mature year, did better given the car's performance ceiling. Leclerc was there or thereabouts, albeit with an illegal engine, while Bottas was still awful, so I don't think it's by a lot, but I'm going to give this one to Max, his 2nd title, in the last year of the 2010s. This decade was a real mixed bag, as there was no generation-defining driver in terms of raw ability over a prolonged period of time. Hamilton, Vettel and Alonso had amazing individual seasons, but couldn't churn out championships in the same way that Fangio, Prost, Clark or Schumacher did. Fernando benefited greatly from his own talents to take his total title tally to 4, while Vettel retained most of his legacy even with 2. Hamilton took advantage of a weaker and more inconsistent field for the latter part of the decade, and took a quartet of victories to equal both Alonso and Kimi from a generation just before his, while Verstappen showed his worth, pipping Lewis to the post in both his debut year for Red Bull and also in the last year of the decade. Rosberg lost his sole triumph, but in reality, he was better than Lewis but didn't really deserve it as a bona fide champion. He was just better than Lewis, who was awful that year. Unbearable Team LH fans often act like 2020 was Hamilton's zenith when it really wasn't. He had several errors like in Austria, Monza and Sochi, and came back from the unspeakable virus that spread around the world in that year far too soon in Abu Dhabi. In terms of pure consistency, I hate to say this, but Verstappen had the better year, so I'm going to give it to him, especially since, given his 5 retirements, that all weren't his fault. He could have potentially nabbed the title from Lewis, despite being quite a margin back on paper in the real-life standings, thanks to Lewis's absence in Sakhir. 2021 was the culmination of what transpired in the seasons leading up to it, and while Max built on his ruthless consistency, Lewis reverted back to his younger self, making errors and failing to capitalise on chances. Imola, Monaco and Baku were all wins he lost due to his own mistakes or poor performance, while his antics at Silverstone and Bottas's bowling alley opening up at Turn 1 in Hungary created an even bigger advantage for Lewis, even if you remove the incidents in Monza and Jeddah. Don't get me wrong, Verstappen wasn't perfect. He stepped over the line in Brazil, and at Turn 1 in Saudi Arabia where he got the time penalty, but in terms of ability, Hamilton did not lose that title in Abu Dhabi. He lost it in any other collection of races where he failed to bring home consistent and decent results. He had a royal flush, yet he still fumbled the bag. Max took his 4th title in this reality in 2021, then beat the field black and blue like he was his dad in both 22 and 23, with no one anywhere near close to his pace and consistency. People tried to invent a title battle with Norris in 2024, but please, the man never got within 50 points of him. I think that anyone else, from the likes of Russell, Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, or even a Gasly or a Hülkenberg, would have won that title. He had it even better than Lewis did in 21, yet he screwed it up. That triumph for Max, while facing less competition than a light breeze in a wind tunnel, helped him claim his 7th title and 6th on the bounce, equaling Prost's run from 1985 to 1990 in this reality. This takes us up to the present day, and leaves us with a completely different version of F1 history. In an alternate reality, where car performance doesn't outright determine the driver's champion, 32 of the 75 total seasons saw a different winner than real life, with some careers becoming a lot more successful than before, and others becoming markedly less so. Fangio, Clark and Prost benefited heavily by having the random variable of reliability thrown by the wayside, while Schumacher's period from 1996 to 98 in cars that weren't fully ready to win titles was also rectified. Lauda took the positive aspects of 1974 and 76 and had the bits he couldn't control removed, while the omittance of car performance really shook up the reckoning from 2005 onwards. Raikkonen and Alonso were given great credit for their best seasons, while Vettel and Hamilton had their statistics diluted due to their inconsistency and a slight hint of having such problems hidden by having the best car. Verstappen gained 2 titles thanks to his Schumacher-esque consistency, and another in 2016 by just delivering most of the time when everyone else didn't, while Hamilton follows his idol Senna in having very high peaks, but when going up against someone who can exploit his weaknesses, he crumbles. Countless real-life one-time champions lost their crowns. I'll quickly zip through them all. Giuseppe Farina, Mike Hawthorne, Phil Hill, John Surtees, Denny Hulme, James Hunt, Mario Andretti, Keke Rosberg, Damon Hill, Jacques Villeneuve, Jenson Button, and Nico Rosberg, while several multiple-timers had their numbers watered down, like Jack Brabham and Nelson Piquet, whose 3 titles became 1, Emerson Fittipaldi, whose 2 became none, and various others like Alberto Ascari, Graham Hill, and Mika Hakkinen, who had their double successes mitigated. I created this video for several reasons. One was to highlight how misleading raw statistics such as total championships, wins or pole positions can be, so that people realise when Sky Sports say Lewis Hamilton is the best in history because he has more than 100 wins, you can recognise that when you have a championship potential car for 11 seasons and an otherwise race-winning potential one for every year of your 18-year-long career, that's really not the most impressive thing in the world. The total championship tallies from this universe loosely correlate with my list of the top 10 drivers in F1 history, with a few exceptions due to factors such as varying career lengths, but as an overall guide, this is a metric that should be used more often. winning in the best car isn't as good as coming a close runner-up in the second best, or if you're Lando Norris, even coming close to winning in the best car can be a struggle. But with that being said, I think that brings today's video to a close. I hope you enjoyed me taking an interesting look into who would be the champions of F1 if the best driver from every season won the title, and if you did, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to see exclusive content, get videos a day early, and have an opportunity to converse with me personally for as little as $1 per month. Big shout out to my already existing Patreon subscribers Andy Lamberts and George Stratford, and a new subscriber Elizabeth Hearn. And you can also take a look at the DRS Train Podcast, which I host alongside Peter Brook, Nav F1, and Ciaron Smith, where we take deep dives into historical topics and race previews and reviews when the F1 season is on. Furthermore, follow my X/Twitter account where I post boiling hot lava takes on F1, IndyCar and NASCAR, and my Instagram for behind the scenes updates. With my shameless plugging over though, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!